So this is what Tocqueville sees very quickly. He's a very intelligent, observant, and imaginative guy. Are you with me so far? Any questions? So I'm calling this a rough compromise or average between all of the selfish interests. What do we call that in this country? We call it the public interest. But it's not really the public interest, is it?
No.
But that's what we call it. And that's what Tocqueville gave the name self-interest properly understood. For millennia, philosophers and theologians have said that what's holding humanity back is greed. If somehow we could learn to restrain our greed, our lives would be much better. Ironically, they say, if you restrict what you want, you will ironically get more. Loving people more than you love yourself will result in other people loving you. It seems to be contra-rational, but in fact, that's what we've been taught for thousands and thousands of years. Very few people have listened, but that's what the great philosophers and theologians have taught. So that's been the solution by great philosophers and theologians for thousands of years. The worst of our faults is greed, and the way to get around it is to restrain our greed. What Tocqueville found that was so wonderful about this country is that we never once act to restrain our greed. We emphasize it. And we've systematized greed in such a way through the Constitution of 1788 to produce the public interest. No one is asking the labor unions to do the right thing. No one is asking the truckers to do the right thing. We're telling them, serve your own selfish interests, and we'll take it from there. We'll funnel those selfish interests through our fragmented political system. And like magic, we'll make it into the public interest. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to restrain yourself at all. Are you a fan of magic at all? Are you a fan of magic?
I love to watch magic.
What's your favorite magic trick?
Well, I don't know a lot of them, but like, I've seen this one where this guy made this card and he put his signature on it, and then he made it magically appear into this other guy's wallet way in the crowd.
I've seen that one too. The one I like is where they make the Statue of Liberty, or it could be, it says that be a huge structure or an animal like an elephant disappear. Some of this stuff is remarkable.
I wonder how it's done. Like, since it's a TV show, it could be done in editing. But when you have it done
Here's how
live,
it's hard to, and imagine the hours of practice that goes into that. Let's take the one about making an elephant disappear on a TV show. That, I actually know how that's done because there was a TV show that exposed how magic was done. Penn and Teller. So what happens, the camera is looking at the elephant, right? And then they say, you see the elephant? And then they put some black shawl around the camera. Then what happens is they take a mirror and they move the mirror like 5 degrees east or west. And now when the camera shines on this mirror, it's facing in a different direction. So that's how they did that trick. I would never have known that unless Penn and Teller had told me that. And that's what's happening, according to Tocqueville, in our political system. They're taking one thing, greed, and making it into something that's very gracious and good, without anybody being less greedy. He says that's America's gift to the world. And the French should adapt it. All countries should adapt it. Because it doesn't require anything on the part of individuals. The system does it for you. Now, this is not that easy to understand. Do you have any questions? Because that's self-interest properly understood.
So what would you, so you're saying that the people, so it recognizes that the people are just always going to be greedy, so it just,
Absolutely.
so all you have to do is basically just kind of like live your life and vote sometimes, and then the system, because no one person's can do anything.
But this is really not individual voters. This is individual voters divided up into pressure groups or interest groups.
Because like no one or no group of people, one group of people or whatever can do something by themselves. It kind of just.
Well, no one group will ever completely dominate our political system. Some will have much more influence than others. And every group that organizes will have its greed represented in the final law. Now, the irony of all of this, and something that Tocqueville never recognized, is that in our history, for centuries, some groups have never been able to organize. They've been so beaten down by American prejudice. In order to organize, you have to have some sense of purpose, some sense that you can make a difference in your life and in the lives of people just like you. But if you've been beaten down, you can't organize. What Tocqueville never recognized was that if you don't organize, then you are completely out of the system. Now, give me one group that for many, many centuries weren't able to organize because they were so beaten down. They had no sense of purpose.
Women.
Women is a good example.
Minorities.
Of course. I mean, you talk about being beaten down. In 1954, the NAACP who was bringing this case, Brown versus Board of Education, before the Supreme Court, wanted to bring scientific proof to the Supreme Court to show the effects of segregation. So they sent a black University of Chicago, Kenneth Clark, a black University of Chicago psychologist down to the South. And this is the experiment he did. He went to these rural, segregated Jim Crow black schools. Do you know what it was?
I know.
And he took little girls, and they'd come into a room, and he said, well, I'm going to give you a present. You have to choose between a white little dolly or a black little dolly. And he showed in every case, we're talking about thousands and thousands of cases without exception, which dolly did the black girl choose?
The white one.
So his point was, this is the effect that racial oppression has on African Americans. They've lost their identity. They've lost a sense of purpose. They've become alienated. They feel that they're powerless, that they're worthless. Those people are not going to be able to form a group, because you form a group with the idea that I can make something happen for me and others like me in the world. Women, we've talked about this over and over and over again. We were so disappointed in this last election. For thousands and thousands of years, women have allowed men to treat them the way men have treated women. It's just remarkable that anyone would, especially when you consider that women have something that men really want, and if they had denied it to them, there would have been amazing changes. They wouldn't even deny this to the men for power, because they felt so beaten down and worthless. This all began to change in the 1960s. You have to admit that's thousands and thousands and thousands of years of women allowing themselves to be mistreated the way they all women had to say was, you'll be sleeping on the couch tonight, but they didn't even do that. They were so beaten down. So how are women going to represent themselves in a system like that when they didn't even have the gumption to form groups which would allow them to play? See, it's forming a group that gives you a ticket to ride in this system. But if you don't have a sense of empowerment, it would never occur to you to form the group in the first place.
Sure.
Native American, I mean, the list goes on and on and on. There's real prejudice. So it never occurred to Tocqueville. That's one of the deficiencies of this otherwise wonderful work, that this system completely ignores those who have been so beaten down by the prejudice of the system, of the culture, that they can't form the groups. Another way to describe this is self-interest properly understood. It's called, you understand why it's called pluralism, right, Hacker? Because all these plural groups.
Right.
No one group by itself makes the policy. One group could dominate the policy. Every group is their interest is somehow represented or echoed in the policy somehow, depending on unity and numbers. Another name for is self-interest properly understood would be enlightened self-interest. Let's take, for example, a city council is debating whether or not a greater proportion of the city budget should go to public schools. How often does that happen? It doesn't happen very often. But let's say some city council in some city in the United States is debating that. Now, on the face of it, why would childless people vote for that? I mean, they're not going to benefit their children. They don't have any children. Why would parents whose kids go to private school, why would they vote for something like that? Why would families whose kids have graduated from public school vote to increase their taxes? Tocqueville would say in America, this would be the reason: enlightened self-interest. We have all these goons, especially these teenage boys, who potentially could, while I'm working and my wife is working, are going to break into my house and my car and steal everything we've worked hard to accumulate, unless they're in school. Enlightened self-interest properly understood. I'm not voting for this increase in taxes, of my taxes, because it's a good thing to do for the society and a good thing to do for these children, because ultimately it's a good thing. Enlightened self-interest. The adjective is enlightened. The subject is selfishness. Ultimately, it'll be good for me. And that's the system, he says, Americans have identified and have made use of. And this is our most exportable product.
Yeah, we don't, I guess people don't make that argument that way enough, because it's like, like last year they tried to do that over in Baldwin County. They're like, we need to raise the property taxes a little bit, because the counties, Baldwin County is one of the fastest growing counties in the country, and there's not enough schools, and they're like, we got to raise it, but the measure failed, and I think they made the argument like, it's good, it's for the children. And that they.
Well, it's an excellent example.
When you foster, when you foster greed, because an excess of greed,
Well, be careful now, when you say forced to greed, it's always there.
But this system's encouraging.
It's encouraging it, exactly.
But, so when you encourage it, I guess you also do it, or Tocqueville's idea is that you do it with the understanding that the people will be smart enough to have foresight and care about, looking forward to seeing, like, the children aren't going to be breaking my house, they're going to be in school, but if the people aren't smart enough to make the connection, then it's just like, no, that's my money, I wanna keep it.
He has confidence in Americans ultimately, not necessarily in one election.
Yeah,
As the crime rate goes up in Baldwin County, we'll see what happens the next time. The next time. It's almost always teenagers, by the way, who are doing this stuff.
but
So we'll-
infrastructure, especially in Mobile,
All right, so is everybody clear about self-interest properly understood? That's what he felt was. Everybody clear about that? He felt that was, Americans were geniuses to figure this out.
And this is a result of individualism.
This is individualism. He sees it in moderation, yeah. It's excess of individualism. The danger is that is when the selfishness takes over and overflows these funnels.
Would you say that it's fair to say that, like, you know, talking about this in terms of like elections, like the person who does a better job explaining why they're in more people's self-interest usually win out?
Remember, it's not individual voters,
Yeah.
and it's not individual members of Congress, or even the president, that are really in control of laws and public policies. It's these interest groups. What else could explain, for example, what percentage of Americans do you think want no regulations on firearms? What would be your guess?
25?
Very
At
few.
most. So how is it possible we have no regulations on firearms?
They organize very well.
Well, that's the point. And the list could go on and on and on.
It's an overwhelming percentage of people who actually want national health care. And we
Of
don't have
course.
that.
Of course.
So, certainly well over the majority.
What about the price of drugs? I mean, we can go on and on and on. Consumers of anything versus the producers. There are 300 million Americans who want low prices on milk, cheese, and butter, and apples. They outnumber the interest groups enormously.
But they have no unity.
What Tocqueville felt was the strongest part of this country actually may be the weakest, and the answer is that all this works well as long as the economy is working well. I think that's the point that you were getting at. When people start suffering from what we call status resentment, status anxiety, it all begins to fall apart. So starting in the 1960s, white males had a monopoly on the workplace in this country. And when minorities and women started taking their place in the workplace, men went berserk. Not for rational reasons. They saw it as not just a loss of jobs to women and minorities, but a loss of manhood. When that stuff starts happening, there's no rhyme or reason to the American political system. During the Great Depression, there was a 25 to 30% unemployment rate. There's no rhyme and reason that this political system is destroyed in a case like that. It was just the charisma. What saved us during the Great Depression was the charisma of Franklin Roosevelt, the power of Franklin Roosevelt, even though he was in a wheelchair. So I've said this many times in our classes that we've had together. This country has been very, very lucky.